Hello, welcome to another new class of human physiology. In this class, we will start about the ovarian cycle. Mostly we will discuss about female menstruation cycle, and as you know, in the female menstruation cycle we have mostly two different cycle. One is the ovarian cycle and second is the uterine cycle. So in the next few classes, including today's class, we will discuss about the ovarian cycle. So let us stay with it. So what different contents will be covered for this class? So we will cover the concept of oogenesis. We will then discuss about embryonic developments and germ cells. We will see how the cells get differentiated to oogonia. We will discuss about the proliferation stages by mitosis. Then we will discuss about follicular cells and germ cell cluster. We will discuss about meiosis, we will discuss about formation of the primordial follicles, and little bit we will give you overview of ovarian and maturation step in the ovarian cycle. So let us discuss one by one. So what is basically oogenesis? As we know, Oo means basically egg, right? So Oo means basically egg, and genesis is basically like formation, right? So genesis means basically formation. So this is basically like egg formation. So in female body, after a certain time, basically when the female body attains puberty, we have to a particular cycle that happens every month, and where the immature egg eventually convert to a matured egg, and after the ovulation the egg awaits for the sperm to enter in case of fertilization happens. So this whole step from starting from the egg development to the egg maturation, and this is kind of called as oogenesis along with the ovarian cycle. So basically the process by which female gametes are formed can be called as oogenesis. And oogenesis, one thing to remember, that it does not start at puberty. It starts with during the fetus development of the baby girl itself, and we will see how it happens, but you have to remember that it starts from long back whenever there is this embryonic development or fetus development of the female baby. Oocytes start developing very early, well before the girl is born. So this is very crucial to remember. And as you remember, we discussed during the female reproductory class, what we have is in the female we have two ovaries, right? So in the female we have two ovaries, and each ovary has a certain number of egg, right? We will discuss how many number of eggs are there, but each cycle, each of the ovarian cycle, a certain egg will eventually start into the ovarian cycle step, and the process of maturation will happen, and via the ovulation the matured egg will be released to the fallopian tube area. So let us see how the embryonic development and the germ cells happen. So what we just said, that this process starts long before than puberty. So in case of female body, it starts during the fetus development, around 3 to 4 weeks of the female embryo formation. At that time in the female body, let us consider there are lot of germ cells that are present in the female fetus, and exactly around maybe 12 to 14 millions of germ cells are present. These are basically stem cells, okay? These are basically different type of stem cells that are present in the female embryo. And what happens, these primordial germ cells, eventually they slowly migrate to the ovary of the female embryo. So what I just said, that about 12 to 14 million of initial primordial germ cells, right? They were initially kind of a stem cell type. They get differentiated, and initially those germ cells, they move towards the female ovary, and when they move towards the female ovary, the initial step of differentiation happens. So from the initial stem cells or the primordial germ cells, the cells get differentiated into a cell called oogonia. So what happened from the primordial germ cells, when these cells move to the female ovary during the first initial 4 to 5 weeks of the embryonic formation, they are in the ovary, the first stages of differentiation initiates, forming the oogonia, and these oogonias are basically the precursor of the oocytes. Let's see, once this oogonia formation happens, so you see like here lot of like oogonia clusters it happened, and how we said that initially the primordial, right, the primordial germ cells were there, they came to the female ovary, and the process of differentiation basically caused the formation of the oogonia, and this oogonia starts to kind of rapidly generate and divide by the process of mitosis. So rapid proliferation of this oogonia happens, and eventually lot of clusters of oogonia, you can see several clusters of oogonia cells eventually form inside of the ovary, right, and this happens highly rapidly and exponentially. And after some time, this oogonia you can see, so on top of the oogonia there is another layer of this green cell which are also called follicular cells. So this formation of the follicular cells initiate, right. So after the initial this germ cell cluster or the oogonia cell cluster, each oogonium cluster eventually gets surrounded by a new cell layer which is called as follicular cells, right, and these are basically somatic type of cells of ovarian origin, and they have like highly lot of different important like function. Basically they support and interact with oogonia and later oocytes. Along with that, they secrete a factor which is called the OMI or oocyte maturation inhibitor. So basically after the mitosis, this follicle, this overall this like oogonia cells, they get into an arrest phase. We will discuss how it get into the arrest phase, but these follicular cells eventually secrete a factor which is called OMI or oocyte maturation inhibitor. They basically kind of stops the meiosis step, and they make these cells into an arrest state condition. So we will see how it happens. So as we said that whenever initial the mitosis happens and lot of oogonium cluster forms, slowly the oogonium cluster will get covered by the follicular cells, right, and what happens that some of these follicular cells start to get into arrest phase, okay. So some of these follicular cells start to become into arrest state condition, arrested phase. So after the mitosis, where they form the oogonium cluster, and eventually when this primary oocyte form after the follicular cell wrap up. So basically initially it was the oogonium, and from the oogonium when the primary oocyte form, many of these old oogoniums starts to degenerate. Basically degenerate, and some of the oogonium eventually they complete the mitosis and they start the meiosis 1 step. They enters the meiosis 1 step, but because this FSA more follicular stimulating cells or these follicular cells, they secretes a factor which is OMI or the oocyte maturation inhibitor. What this oocyte maturation inhibitor does is they basically arrest this primary oocyte in this meiosis 1 step, okay. So they are unable to complete the meiosis 1 step, and then they get arrested here. So what we just said again to recapitulate, that some of the oogonium starts to degenerate, but those few oogonium from the primary oocyte, they complete their mitosis step, they enter the meiosis 1 step, and due to the presence of the OMI maturation inhibitor factor which are secreted by the follicular cells, these are the follicular cells which are secreting the OMI or the oocyte maturation inhibitor. Due to that, majority of these like the primary follicular cells, they get arrested, right, they get arrested in the meiosis 1 phase. And if you exactly want to know which phase of the meiosis 1, in the prophase 1 phase of the meiosis 1. So basically in the prophase 1 phase of the meiosis 1, they get arrested, okay. And eventually, so what we are left with, what we said, that some of the oogonia got into the arrested phase. We are still left with lot of like primary kind of oogonium, right? We are still left with lot of primary oogonium, but we said that lot of this initial oogonium starts to degenerate via the process of apoptosis, which is the programmed cell death. So basically lot of oogonium now starts to die and degenerate. So once they starts to die and degenerate, what we will leave with? We will basically leave with some of the primordial follicle. So primordial follicles were initially those arrested oogonium or arrested oocytes, which had a wrapping, so these were, so primary oocytes, those were in the arrested condition and they were having a wrapped follicular cells, right. So these are basically represented here. If we zoom one of this cell, you can see this form the primordial follicle cell. So basically it goes into the arrested phase, right, basically it goes to the arrested phase. But these cells are nicely covered with these follicular cells. This is called as primary oocyte. And follicular cells together they form as primordial follicle, okay, primordial follicle cells, okay. So this is called as primordial follicle cells, okay. So what we had initially, we had this arrested primary oocyte and then that got wrapped up with the nice green color follicular cells. And whenever these nice follicular cells covered the primary oocyte, together they form the primordial follicle. And this primordial follicle, they basically stayed in the arrested phase. This primordial follicle, they are generally in the arrested phase, and till how long they are in arrested phase? Till the female body reaches the puberty. So basically this is very important. We have to remember that the primordial follicles which are in the arrested phase, in which phase? In the meiosis 1, and exactly if you say it is in the prophase 1 of the meiosis 1 stage, they get arrested and those cells eventually still stay intact till puberty stage. But in between there are lot of cell reduction in the number happens, and we will see in the next slide how these numbers from initial primordial germ cells to primordial follicle cells, how the numbers come. But when the female body reaches puberty, what we just said, some of these arrested primordial follicle stage, they initiates into the ovarian cycle where the maturation stage start or initiate. Now let us see how the germ cell number eventually goes. So what we said initially, we have lot of these primordial germ cells or like stem cells, and total like female has like 2 ovary, if we consider female has 2 ovary. So each of these ovary basically has about like 7 million of primordial germ cells. So total how much primordial germ cells they have during this embryonic development? Almost 14 millions of primordial germ cells female body has. But after that, as we said, when it forms like this primary oogonium or like the matured oogonium by the process of mitosis, lot of this the differentiated oogonium starts to degenerate. So from 14 million, eventually the number drops to about like 4 million when this primary oocyte form, okay. So when the primary oocyte form and they are basically arrested, the number goes down from 14 million to about like 4 million in number, and in this process in between you remember like apoptosis happened. Okay. So basically a newborn baby girl has about like 4 million of primordial follicle. This is highly important to remember. A newborn baby girl has about like 4 million of total primordial follicles, or this 4 million, these are also, this can be called as oocyte or primary oocyte. So basically these 4 millions of oocytes eventually remain till the puberty, right, and they are arrested in the prophase 1 phase. Okay. So basically like whenever the body reaches to puberty, few cells eventually initiates the ovarian cycle. But one thing to remember, from this baby girl, from this birth of the baby girl, where we have the 4 million of oocytes or the primordial follicular cells, till the puberty lot more reduction of the cell happen. So eventually the 4 million cells doesn't stay, it becomes about like 500k cells, like further and further degeneration happen. So one crucial thing out of all these you have to remember, that each baby is getting birth with a finite number of primordial follicle cells, which are, again we are repeating this same thing again and again, which is the 4 million primordial follicle cells. But it is highly important to know, because in cases of male there is no limitations of how many sperm cells are produced, right, because males can produce sperm cells till a very late age of their life. So unless there is any hormonal deficiency, and in some classes we discuss like what can be the disease condition. So unless there is infertility condition in male, generally males still can produce the sperm cell. But in cases of female it is very tricky, because each female is getting born with only 4 million of primordial germ cell or primordial follicular cell, and from this even 4 million of primordial follicle cells, as we said, only 500k of the oocytes they get survived. So at puberty eventually a finite pool, which is like about 500k of oocytes, that survives. So a female has highly limited number of cells, it is only 500k, and that's why a female needs to kind of take care of their body in a way so that their egg cells doesn't degenerate faster, because a few number of the oocytes are only can participate in a potential chances of fertilization whenever the sperm cell enters during the intercourse. So it is highly tricky. So lastly, again, like at the 5th month of the fetal life, initially the 14 millions of germ cells, the primordial germ cells are present, and then by the apoptosis these 14 million cells, eventually lot of cells died, and even in the newborn baby 2 million of primordial follicles are present per ovary. 2 million are like each ovary has about like 2 million primordial follicle cells. So together it become about 4 millions of primordial follicle cells, and they are arrested, you remember they are arrested in the meiosis 1 phase, right, and then each eventually what happens till puberty. So at puberty, so when the female attains the puberty, eventually some more degeneration happens. So from 4 million of initial primordial follicles, they are like left with only 500k of like oocytes. So from the 500k of oocytes in each menstruation cycle, so each menstruation cycle, only 15 to 20 number of these oocytes, actually participates per ovary, in the ovarian cycle, okay, in the ovarian cycle. So, you have to remember that the female has only limited number of 500k of the oocyte cell, and from there per ovarian cycle only 15 to 20 oocytes per ovary, they got kind of they come to the ovarian cycle for a process of maturation, followed by when the ovulation happen, the matured egg, only one matured egg, they comes out from the ovary to the fallopian tube. And in the fallopian tube, they wait for potential chances of fertilization whenever there is an entry of sperm. Okay. So, eventually ovarian cycle is a series of changes that occurs in a body, which is like last about 28 days, and during these changes what happens, basically the immature oocytes which were initially in the arrested phase of the meiosis 1, they complete their meiosis 1 stage, then they goes to the meiosis 2 phase where they again get arrested, and eventually at day 14 the ovulation happen, the matured egg eventually comes out in the fallopian tube. There they wait for another 14 days for a potential sperm infusion, and if that fertilization happens, the final meiosis 2 step occur, causing like the embryonic formation or development. And in the next class we will thoroughly discuss about the ovarian cycle. So, basically we will see like how all this maturation happens step by step, from like initially this primordial follicle cells, initially the primordial follicle cells or oocyte. We will see how like the stages of maturation, happens, and at day 14 when the ovulation happens, eventually this matured egg comes out. Okay. So, in the next class thoroughly we will discuss about this. Think about it, what are the 3 phases of the ovarian cycle, when does ovulation occur, and what is primordial follicles. You can refer different books including like Guyton's medical book, Tortora's textbook. Thank you again for attending today's class. If you have further question, please drop your question via email, or you can also discuss during the live sessions. Thank you again for attending the human physiology class. So, we will meet very soon with another new class. Thank you.